Okay, we're here in Photoshop right now, and we're going to use it to take a look at a few different examples of history, design history to be specific. I'm going to start off here with Art Nouveau. This is an example of a Art Nouveau facade. It was a style that emerged in France between 1980 and 1910, and essentially it's a new form of art, basically France's attempt to become modern, break away from the type of design, the design that was being created around them. It was a deliberate break from 19th century historicism. Here you have an example of a park bench, which has a lot of those stylized, curvilinear type forms, strong emphasis on use of the wrought iron, and this sort of thing you also see, as I mentioned, within the architecture, and not only architecture, but it's used within graphic design, fashion, jewelry, and all different types of art forms. Here we have a Moulin Rouge poster, which makes use of handmade type of typography, almost resembling like a woodblock print. And there's these strong figurative graphic elements. Take a look at another one. Here we have use of an old style serif. It still has that handmade quality to it. And looking back at the first image, obviously there's this emphasis on Mother Nature, almost like botanical type floral elements. Very dreamy. Back to this final image, this really pushes the point of almost a handmade look to the typography. Very handmade. And then moving away from Art Nouveau, we move over into Germany, and these styles do overlap because from 1890 to 1910 you have the Art Nouveau, but then Bauhaus really expands throughout Germany between like 1919 and 1933, but in some cases these styles do overlap. So this is the home of the Bauhaus. Bauhaus, there's an emphasis on simple lines and shape. It's very minimalist. A real emphasis on use of positive, negative space, generous, open space, vertical lines. Form is dictated by the function of the piece. So here we have form follows function. And this sort of approach really moved into modern skyscrapers too. Bauhaus example of furniture using wrought iron, very thin, serpentine. And we really have a reflection of modernity and the power of industrialization and mechanics. Oftentimes modern materials are used in the design, so this is a perfect example. And we move on up, and here we have an example of a Bauhaus poster. Solid use of the grid, use of sans serif, and once again there's an emphasis on vertical lines, use of alignment, and a lot of generous positive negative space. It definitely isn't crowded. There's a real order to it. Same thing with this. Use of the grid, positive and negative space. Move on up, away from the Bauhaus. Then the Russians get into the mix. This is like one of my favorite styles. Russian Constructivism, 1919 through 1934. Obviously, it's overlapping the Bauhaus and perhaps parts of Art Nouveau too. Extremely avant-garde, clear formal order, emphasis on geometric shapes, clean lines and planes, bold, symbolic, impersonal colorings. So there's a use of symbolic colors within these Russian constructivist pieces. Here we have a use of photography intermixed with the red spot color. Most of these pieces had a real social and economic and political undertone, especially this one, liberators. Here we have the use of the sans serif, and we move on up. This looks like someone's attempt to actually create a constructivist poster. This has a collage element to it. Then moving away from Constructivism, Russian Constructivism, we get into Art Deco. So here we have actually an Art Deco stamp. Art Deco around 1920 to 1930s. This is obviously the Chrysler Building in Manhattan. And with Art Deco, there's simple, clean shapes with streamlined look and feel. Geometric ornamentation, and the motifs oftentimes do have a connection to flora and fauna. Modern man-made materials in combination with natural materials. So here, this is actually Niagara Mohawk Building in Syracuse. And then we move into some Art Deco posters. Here we have the steam engine. Strong angular shapes, and oftentimes there's these zigzags that are used. And still there's an emphasis, there's a use of the symbolic color too. A lot of warm and cool colors are used in Art Deco posters. Another Art Deco poster. This is a pretty powerful one. And evidently there's a feeling of glamour and elegance in many of these, especially with this one here. The use of the sans serif. Here we have the real tight leading. The lines are real close together. And then it looks like the letter, the sans serif, is pretty closely tracked too. And then the final Art Deco piece. Here we have this Art Deco stamp, which is kind of like Gotham City and Batman. Has that relief quality, a very stylized rendition of an eagle, and you have those zigzag patterns and the use of the almost like triangular chevron. That's another characteristic too. Then moving away from Art Deco, obviously Art Deco is it's basically an evolution of Art Nouveau. We have the Art Nouveau, which we were looking at before. Then the Art Deco gets a lot more geometric and more connected to the machine age, almost like futurist painting. But when we get into this Swiss movement, or international typographical style, what they essentially want to do is take what the Germans did with the Bauhaus and actually make it more mathematical, more scientific, and more exact. And so you have almost like this maniacal approach to working with the grid, where the grid is everything in this type of design. And use of the sans serif pretty much strictly, oftentimes Helvetica. International typographic style emerged in Switzerland. We have strong adherence to the grid, feeling of austerity, and let's take a look at this one. Austerity, spontaneity. And mostly they're asymmetrical layouts. In each of these cases, we can go back and we see asymmetrical layout. And this one's asymmetrical too. And you can see the use of alignment, the way this little typographical cluster aligns with the bottom of that upper case F, sans serif F, move up to here. Another asymmetrical. And then even this is asymmetrical. And then we move away from all of these European styles. And basically, we have the emergence of the New York movement. all of these Europeans basically, or obviously, just migrated over to New York, the United States, and here we have the Roaring Twenties, an emphasis on rock and roll. So modernism, oftentimes combine photography and typography, creative use of negative space, very spontaneous use of imagery and coloring, and oftentimes extremely informal organization. For example, in this, I believe this is a Paul Rand poster, subway poster score. It's a little bit eccentric, informal organization. And these designers really want to break away from the European rigidity. The Bauhaus grid, the German grid, and the Swiss grid became a little bit too repressing for them. They wanted to break out and explore. So here you have one of the pioneers, Milton Glaser, an icon of the 20th century. Let's see, I'll zoom in here, and here see his very famous rendition of Bob Dylan, which was used for a book cover. Since we're in Photoshop, let me move over here and zoom in. You can see that. So that's extremely experimental for that point in history. He was just breaking out. And then the I Love New York logo. There's an image of Milton Glaser himself. And then here's another Milton Glaser piece based on his interpretation of Pablo Picasso. Use of symbolic color. And move up. Here's a Paul Rand poster, actually. Really minimalist, almost extremely stylized with this pictograph, obviously. Use of alignment. So basically with this modernist movement, there's a gathering of painters, sculptors, designers, and even musicians and writers in New York City between 1940 and 1950, and even into the 60s. And they were basically the forefront of the art world. These artists inspired the avant-garde painting movements of the 20th century. And obviously, many of you are familiar with Jackson Pollock, who's one of those pioneers at the time. And oh, this is a really neat piece. I believe this is by Glaser, Milton Glaser, with all these hands. And then we break out of modernism and move into postmodernism. And this is probably what put an end to aesthetics. Here we have Marcel Duchamp's The Fountain. The idea is just go into a junkyard, look for a random object such as this, something that's part of the throwaway society, and use that to communicate an idea, make an artistic statement. So then, in terms of graphic design, we move into this postmodernist approach to working with typography. Really, form doesn't follow function like back during the Bauhaus. There's not always a strict adherence to the grid. Readability is sacrificed. Clarity is sacrificed. And a lot of times there's this borrowing or appropriation of styles from past periods that are combined together in very eccentric ways. Irony becomes a big component. This is actually Leonardo Sonali, this Italian designer, which is supposedly part of these postmodern era, but it still does have a formality to it. You still can see an order. It definitely a reference to the Swiss movement and Bauhaus within this piece. But then, you move up. Here you see more of this postmodern approach. Almost there's like a collage-like type quality in this. And the artists want to be more expressive. This almost has a bad boy attitude with this use of illustration, cropping of typography, spattering of paint. You can see all sorts of references to art history. Move up to this final piece. Here we have, looks like David Carson, one of the big guns of today, one of the big proponents of postmodernism. David Carson. Here you have all of his collage-like layering of typography, cropping of imagery, cropping of type, looking at type more as an abstract design element. So that's a quick overview of the history of design, and hopefully you get something out of it.